Good day, students. Today we're going to begin discussing our new unit, Political Influence of the United States. So we're going to be looking at England in particular to see where most of the influences of our political system come from. And so the question we're going to be asking is, why did the United States adopt English forms of government? And this is something you're going to have to answer at the end in both a practical manner and in a philosophical manner. So keep that in mind as we go forward. But everyone has an influence. Obviously, the United States has influences from England. But who's someone who's influenced you a lot? Well, if we get this idea of thinking influence. Interestingly enough, I would probably note my sister is one. And I say sister in quotations because if we're going with the English theme here, she's actually from the UK. So, just a little bit of backstory about why she's influential in my life. At 22, she took a cross-country trip across the country. She was debating about whether going back to England or not, and long story short, she basically came and was a nanny, so to speak. But so, she was going to either stay in the States or go back to the UK, and at 22 she said, well, I'll just take a cross-country trip across the country. So she did her cross-country trip, saw a lot of great things in the United States, big country, and she was about ready to come home from LA. And if you've ever been to LAX, or if you've played even certain video games that shall not be named, you'll see that there's kind of like Philadelphia airport. If you've ever been there too, there's a part where you have to walk out in the middle of the street, and then you get picked up, and there's an island in the middle. So she stepped out on this street to take a picture of her group before they left, and she actually got hit by a taxi cab that had where the driver had fallen asleep, and he hit her at about 60 miles an hour. And so then she spent the next 18 hours in surgery at UCLA. Doctors really struggled to both save her life, and they ended up doing so, but they ended up having to amputate one of her legs, and really should have been a double amputee. So put it this way, this was 1993. It took her another 2 years before she could really walk on her own after that. So in 1995 she was able to do that. But she was pretty inspirational. Today she never questioned why me. She persevered through that, and eventually she went to school at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, became a photographer, and today is a successful photographer. Has her own business, traveled the world, been published. So it's someone that I look at and say, hey, this is what you can do to persevere, and my sister's influenced me in that way. So I'd be curious to see who has influenced you. This will be the first question you have to answer. Please write this down on a separate document or in the text box below. Who has influenced you and why? So the first thing that the American colonists took with them is that influenced them from England is tradition. And one of the things that they brought with them were these ideas of justice, equality, and popular sovereignty. And the English really got those from the Romans. Up until the time of Julius Caesar, Rome existed as a republic where senators represent the people. This kind of representation would later exist in the British Kingdom when Parliament was formed in the 13th century. A Parliament, this is a key word here, simply is a form of a representative body of government where, kind of like a Congress or an assembly, where representatives are elected and then they vote on what laws to be passed. Parliament really became, in England at least, the most powerful body in the country. So the king was although he was the head of state, was no longer as powerful as Parliament. In other words, to do anything, he had to get the permission of Parliament. And so in order to enact laws, they had to come from Parliament. It was an idea of representation. And this was different than Holland. Holland was the only other democracy at the time of really the founding of all the colonies in America. In fact, New York, New Jersey, and even Pennsylvania were at one point called part of New Netherland. And so Holland had an influence too, except the difference with their democracy is that, number one, it was very direct. It was more direct than the English system. And number two, it required a unanimous vote to do anything. So the democracy in Holland was very, very slow and very, very difficult and tedious. And in fact, when John Adams went to Holland to try and get funding for the American Revolution from the Dutch, it took him a long time because the Dutch just simply needed a unanimous vote on pretty much everything at the time when it came to doing anything by the government. So the colonists adopted England's foreign democracy, not just because many people came from there, but also because it was a little bit more practical. And then thirdly, because frankly, England had a stronger navy and they were able to push the Dutch out of the United States or out of the colonies. So to some degree there's a practical aspect of simply more power, and that's why the colonists accepted more of an English form of government. But to some degree it also works a little bit better. There were certainly other Roman influences as well, not just the idea of a republic or representative democracy. Many founding fathers read Roman philosophers. For example, Cicero was a huge influence, and he was well known for advocating a republic, which was a democratic form of government, which is what we have in the United States. The other principle that came from England was this idea of common law. We're going to go over common law a little bit more. But common law simply refers to law made by judges through decisions in specific cases. By looking at patterns in individual cases, judges made similar rulings and established customary or common laws to all people under the authority of the court of law. Today, the common law tradition is used in every legal system in the country but Louisiana, which actually has French influences. So while the federal government does not have a common law system due to the fact that we have a written constitution, federal judges do use this heritage to help decide cases. So in other words, common law is the idea of applying old rulings in court cases, both in civil disputes and in criminal disputes, to current and future court rulings. For example, a Supreme Court justice may look at the past court decisions on issues such as freedom of speech and make their ruling based on those past decisions. How does this look at in the courtroom? Well, let's say that you're convicted on robbery, and there's been a certain amount of years that someone's had to serve in jail for robbing X amount of dollars. If you committed that same crime and stole an equivalent to that amount of money, chances are you're going to spend the same amount of time in jail. If someone was, for example, convicted of murder, depending on the gruesomeness of the murder and what people in the past got for the same type or the same amount of severity, they would also you would receive the same penalty that they received. So it's the idea of making sure that judges do not just make arbitrary rulings. This actually works out well for citizens, where a judge can't just hand down a harsh sentence to someone because they don't like the person, and consequently they also can't hand down a very limited sentence because they like the person. We make sure that justice is equal and applied equally. This works out in many of our Supreme Court rulings now. In the recent, for example, the recent same-sex marriage decision over the summer in 2015, that came out of other Supreme Court rulings on the issue. So common law is a really important principle that we use for deciding justice in the United States. It's something we're going to analyze a little bit more later in the year. You don't have to be aware of all the implications of common law right now, but the one thing you do have to be aware of is the idea that previous court cases or previous court decisions will influence future court decisions. One reason Parliament was created in England was to limit the king in its power. It's quite common to hear that a king has absolute sovereign power in a territory. In other words, the king makes all the laws and enforces all the laws. By creating a body of government, however, such as Parliament, the people of England decided that the power and authority to dispute the king rested in the people, and therefore Parliament itself was a check on all the king's actions. This body of government allowed each of the king's actions to be open to scrutiny, and having a parliament made sure that the king must first win public support through the representative system. Obviously, since most of the public officials are evaluated on public support, the creation of Parliament made sure that the king would serve the people of his kingdom and not himself. And this created this principle called limited government. When a government is limited by law of what it can and cannot do, it's called limited government. Pretty easy, huh? The principle of limited government affects our country in many ways. By instituting this principle, we the people are making sure that the government we give power to does not become all-powerful. When our government was created, the founders were very familiar with how the British government was limited. They were aware of the fact that the Crown had to give suspected criminals a trial by jury, right? They were aware of the fact that the Crown could not jail someone indefinitely. It is exactly these reasons why many of the colonists began to feel that they were being suppressed when the Crown began to demand certain things of the American colonists. Now remember, the American colonists at the time were British citizens. They were expecting the government to treat them certain ways and not do certain things that law forbade them from doing. The colonists were also very familiar that the government can, does, and has abused its power over the people. You know, at this time, there were many of the colonists, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, were coming out of the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation, where governments cracked down on religious freedom and new ideas that were coming out of place, including the church as well. So, in the minds of many colonists, limited government was very necessary to make sure that people had a way to make a life for themselves and to express their views clearly. They also were very familiar with other things going on at the time. For example, Louis XV was well known for being an absolute power. He would also often say his statement at the time was, "The state is me," essentially summarizing his feelings that as he, as king in France, could do whatever he wanted because he alone was the state. And in 1685 he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which granted the freedom of worship simply because he detested the Protestant movement in France. So colonists are aware of that. They're also aware of, at least some of them at the time, the transatlantic slave trade, which subjected millions of Africans to slavery throughout America. They're also aware of the Spanish Inquisition, which gave the Spanish crown a policy of either exiling Jews who were established in Spain or forcing Christians who were not practicing Catholicism to give up their brand of faith under threat of torture and threat of death. If either party refused, well, that's what would happen. And so many people actually left these countries for Holland, even some people in England, and then they went over to the United States. So there was this idea that, all right, we need limited government. And through many wars in England at this time, such as the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, England became further established in the ideas of limited government and making sure that the government is restricted in what it can do. This is a really important principle, so I wanted to go over this Freyer diagram with you. A Freyer diagram, this is really easy actually. It's going to be something that I'm going to require you to do in the future, so it's something worth paying attention to now. It has 4 categories to it. It has a definition, some associated ideas, and examples of the topic, and non-examples of the topic. So with limited government, for example, we can see the definition could be a government that does not have absolute power, can only do what citizens allow them to do. Some associated ideas with this would be the rule of law, personal rights, equality, term limits on presidents. These are all ideas of, or associated ideas of limited government. Some examples of limited government include the fact that the government cannot tell you what religion you have to follow, or any religion whatsoever. The government cannot force that on you. Another example is the government can't enter your house without getting a warrant first. A warrant is simply a court-approved order that allows the authorities to enter into your property. So the courts itself actually are a protection against government. So courts themselves are an idea of limited government. Some non-examples of limited government are the ideas of a president deciding to disregard a Supreme Court decision, just saying, I'm just going to do what I want, screw you guys. Or a controlling political party passes a law that makes it a crime to belong to another party. Those are not ideas of limited government. So in conclusion, a couple of concluding thoughts. American colonists brought multiple influences with them from England that helped construct their ideas of an ideal government. These influences centered around the ideas of representation as embodied by the Parliament, common law, and limited government. Common law centers around the idea that judges have to take into consideration what other judges have decided when making their decisions. And limited government is very important, and it puts restrictions on the government, usually in the form of a law or constitution, like the English did, especially with the English Bill of Rights, in order to restrict the power of government. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Your homework is below. Again, you're going to be asked to summarize where English influences came from and how they were both practical and philosophical. And looking forward to diving into this unit a little bit more with you. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Have a great day, guys.